She didn't scream. That's what got him. Most kids her age, 7, maybe 8, pigtails coming loose on one side, a backpack shaped like a ladybug sitting next to her on the picnic table. Most kids in that situation would have been crying, screaming, running toward any set of headlights that pulled into the rest stop. But she just sat there, feet dangling off the edge of the bench, not quite reaching the ground, watching the highway like she was waiting for a specific car, like she knew exactly which one was supposed to come back for her. It was 2:47 in the morning, and Declan Farrow almost didn't stop. He'd been driving for 6 hours straight, which wasn't unusual. Sleep wasn't something that came easily to men in his line of work. There were too many debts to track, too many loose ends that had a way of becoming very permanent problems if you didn't handle them personally. He had a meeting in 4 hours, 3 states away, and stopping at a rest stop off I-70 wasn't part of the plan. But then his headlights swept across the picnic area, and he saw her. Before we go any further, if you're new to Sadie's Romance Library, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because this story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. And if you've been here before, you already know the endings here aren't what you think they're going to be. Now, back to Declan Farrow. He pulled the Escalade to a stop along the curb, killed the engine, and sat there for a full 30 seconds just watching her, checking the parking lot. There were 2 other vehicles, a semi parked at the far end, engine running, driver probably asleep, and a minivan with a busted tail light near the restrooms. No movement from either. The girl hadn't looked up yet. He got out of the car. The night air was cold for October, carrying that particular kind of quiet that only exists at highway rest stops in the middle of nowhere. The white noise of distant traffic, the hum of vending machines, the smell of exhaust and cut grass and something sweet, like whatever was in the kid's juice box sitting open and forgotten next to her backpack. His shoes on the pavement were loud enough that she finally looked up. She didn't flinch. She didn't scramble backward or grab her bag or do any of the things a child alone in the dark was supposed to do when a 6'2" stranger in a black coat walked toward her. She just looked at him with these serious gray eyes, assessed him the way an old person would, and said, "You're not my dad?" "No," Declan said. "I'm not, I figured," she said, and looked back at the highway. He stopped a few feet away, far enough to not be threatening, close enough to hear her if she said something quiet. "How long have you been here?" She thought about it. "Since before it got dark." He didn't let that land on his face, kept his expression exactly where it always was, which was nowhere, unreadable. It was one of the first things you learned in his world. Let something hit your face, you let someone know where to aim. But inside, something shifted. Since before it got dark, it was nearly 3 in the morning. That meant she'd been sitting at this picnic table for somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. "What's your name?" he asked. "Audrey," she said. Then, like an afterthought, "Audrey Page, where's your dad, Audrey Page?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, like she was choosing each word, "He forgot me." Declan looked at her. "What do you mean forgot? We stopped here." She pointed at the vending machines. "He went to get me chips." And then his phone rang, and he got back in the car. A pause, and he drove away. The simplicity of it, the way she said it without crying, without accusation, just as a sequence of events that had happened and could not be unhappened, was the thing that made it worse. "Did you try to wave someone down?" 3 people stopped. She held up 3 fingers. 2 drove away when I came close. 1 called the police. She glanced toward the highway entrance. "They haven't come yet. That had been hours ago." He didn't say that. "You have a phone?" She shook her head. "Dad has it. He was holding it for me." Declan stood there in the dark, 6 hours from his meeting, running calculations the way he always ran calculations, variables, risks, outcomes. The smart play was clear. Call 911 himself, stay until they arrived, leave, clean. Simple. None of this became his problem. He looked at Audrey Page, who was looking back at the highway again, patient as a stone. He sat down on the opposite bench. She glanced at him sideways. Not scared, just curious. "You're not leaving?" she said. "Not yet." She seemed to think about whether that was acceptable. Then she reached into her backpack, ladybug, red with black spots, one antenna slightly bent, and pulled out a granola bar. She broke it in half without being asked and held one piece out to him across the table. He took it. He wasn't hungry, but you don't refuse something like that. They sat there together in the vending machine light, the semi-idling at the far end, the highway going on forever in both directions, and Declan Farrow, who had not done a single uncalculated thing in 11 years, tried to figure out what he was going to do with a 7-year-old girl who'd been abandoned at a rest stop off I-70 and hadn't cried once. What he didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, was that the minivan with the busted taillight wasn't empty, and it had been there since before Audrey arrived. He called it in 20 minutes later. Not 911, he had reasons, complicated ones, for preferring not to involve local dispatch directly. He called a number that rang 3 times and was answered by a woman who simply said yes instead of hello. Lena, that was his assistant, had been for 6 years, knew everything, asked nothing. I need you to run a name, Audrey Page. Child, approximately 7 years old. Missing persons if there's a report. A pause. Keyboard sounds. Audrey Page, age 8. Report filed at 11:43 p.m. out of Jefferson County. Father is listed as. Another pause. Longer this time. Declan. What? The father is listed as Garrett Page. Occupation listed as Regional Sales Manager. But there's a flag on the name. Her voice went careful, very careful. He's connected to the Sorrento Group. Not directly. 2 steps removed. Shell Company. Declan looked at Audrey, who had fallen asleep sitting up, her head resting against her ladybug backpack, her breathing slow and even. 2 steps removed from the Sorrentino Group, which meant Garrett Page hadn't forgotten his daughter. Garrett Page had left his daughter, intentionally, at a rest stop at 6 p.m., knowing she'd be alone after dark. The question was why. Pull everything you can on Garrett Page, he said quietly, turning away from the table. Financial records, travel, phone activity, and run the plates on A. He glanced over his shoulder at the minivan. Silver Chrysler minivan, busted left tail light, parked at the east restroom block. Run it now, Declan. Lena's voice was the way it got when she was about to say something he wasn't going to like. The van plates come back to a logistics company, which is a known front for who? The Sorrentinos. He didn't move, didn't breathe wrong. Just stood there in the parking lot with the highway behind him and a sleeping 8-year-old 10 feet away and a van full of God knows what parked 40 yards to his left, and let that information settle into place. This wasn't an accident. Audrey Page hadn't been forgotten. She'd been left here as bait. Now, here is where I need you to understand something about Declan Farrow, because on the surface, powerful man, expensive car, phone calls made to people who answer without saying hello, he sounds like a villain. And that's fair. By most conventional definitions, that's exactly what he was. But the Sorrentino Group and Declan Farrow had a history that ran longer and uglier than most people in his world would admit. And what Declan had that the Sorrentinos didn't, what he'd always had, even before the money and the power and the calculating silences, was a line. He had a line, and leaving an 8-year-old girl at a highway rest stop as bait crossed it. He walked back to the table, crouched down to eye level with the sleeping kid, studying her face. She had a smear of something purple on her cheek, grape juice maybe, or a marker. Her sneakers were light-up ones, small, faded pink stars along the side. He'd never had children, had never particularly planned to. His life didn't make room for things like that, things that could be used against you, taken, broken, things that made you vulnerable in ways you couldn't afford. He looked at Audrey Page and thought, very clearly, nobody's using this kid for anything. He straightened up and walked toward the minivan. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He just walked up to the driver's side window, which was cracked 2 inches, and said, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to drive away." Silence from inside. "The girl is with me now," he said. "Whatever Garrett Page told you, whatever you were waiting for, it's done. You can tell your people that Declan Farrow sends his regards, and that the next time they want to leave a child at a highway rest stop as leverage, they should consider that I take that kind of thing personally." A long pause from inside the van. Then the engine turned over. The minivan reversed slowly, pulled out of the parking space, and disappeared down the on-ramp. Declan watched it go. Then he pulled out his phone and called the one number he never called unless he had no other option. A man answered on the second ring. "This is a surprise," I need a favor, Declan said. And then I need to ask you something. The order of those things matters. I know, the favor first. He looked back at the table where Audrey was still asleep. I have a child, 8 years old, abandoned at a rest stop, used as bait by the Sorrentino group in connection with a man named Garrett Page. I need her safe, off record, and I need to know what Page gave them. The man on the other end said nothing for a moment. And the question? The question, Declan said, is whether you already know about this. Another pause. Longer. Come in, the man said. Both of you. That was how Declan Farrow, who had been driving away from law enforcement in every sense for 11 years, drove toward a federal building at 4:30 in the morning, with an 8-year-old girl asleep in the back seat of his Escalade, her ladybug backpack buckled in beside her like a passenger. She woke up somewhere around the 3rd hour of driving. Not startled, not confused, just blinked twice, looked out the window at the pre-dawn dark, and said, "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," he said. She looked at the back of his head. "Do you promise?" He'd made very few promises in his life. The ones he made, he kept. That wasn't virtue, it was practicality. A man who didn't keep his promises was a man who couldn't be trusted, and a man who couldn't be trusted had a very short career. But this felt different. "Yes," he said. "I promise." She seemed to take that seriously. She looked out the window again. Then, "What's your name?" "Declan," she repeated, like she was filing it. "Okay." She fell back asleep 10 minutes later. He watched her in the rearview mirror, this small, serious kid who'd sat alone in the dark for 9 hours without breaking, who'd offered a stranger half her granola bar, who'd asked him to make a promise and then trusted it immediately, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Responsible. For something that mattered. What Lena had found in Garrett Page's financial records, by the time they arrived, was a story that was both complicated and, at its heart, very simple. Garrett Page owed money, a specific kind of money, to a specific kind of people. The Sorrentinos had given him a way to clear the debt. He'd taken it. The currency wasn't cash. The currency was Declan Farrow. Garrett had known, through connections, through the same network of whispers that kept men like him perpetually adjacent to danger, that Declan used this particular stretch of I-70 on the last Thursday of every month, that he drove alone, that he stopped at exactly 2 rest stops, that he would not, under any circumstances, leave a child alone in the dark. The plan was elegant, in the way that cowardly plans sometimes were. Leave Audrey at the stop, wait for Declan to find her, follow Declan when he inevitably got involved, use the girl as leverage to force Declan into a meeting that would, in all likelihood, end with Declan Farrow not leaving. Garrett Page had calculated everything correctly, except for one thing. He hadn't calculated that Declan had his own history with the Sorrentinos, that the favor Declan called in at 3 a.m. was owed by a man inside the federal system who had been quietly building a case against the Sorrentino group for 4 years, that the information Declan brought with him, Lena's records, the van plates, Garrett's financial trail, was exactly the thread that had been missing, and he hadn't calculated that Declan Farrow, when he made a promise, kept it. The federal building smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Audrey sat in a chair that was too big for her, feet dangling again, working through a packet of crackers that someone had produced from somewhere, watching everything around her with those serious gray eyes. The man Declan had called, a senior investigator named Hollis, who had aged a decade since Declan last saw him and looked like he'd earned every year, came in and sat across from both of them. "She's not a witness," Declan said, before Hollis could open his mouth. "She's not involved. Her father used her without her knowledge, and she has no information relevant to your case. Whatever you need from her, you get through me." Hollis looked at Audrey. Audrey looked back at him. "She looks pretty calm," Hollis observed. "She's been calm since I found her." Declan's voice didn't change. "She sat alone at a rest stop for 9 hours without telling a stranger her last name until she trusted him. Don't mistake that for being fine. She's processing." Audrey, who had been listening to all of this, reached into her backpack and produced a slightly bent granola bar. She held it out toward Hollis. Hollis blinked, took it. "See," Audrey said to Declan, "he's okay." The thing about Declan Farrow was that he had a reputation, and reputations, in his world, were everything. People knew he was ruthless because they'd seen evidence of it. People knew he was precise because they'd experienced it. People believed he was cold because he gave them every reason to. What happened in the weeks after that rest stop didn't make headlines. It wasn't supposed to. The Sorrentino case, which had been stalled for 4 years, broke open in a way that the people involved would later describe, in closed-door rooms, as unexpected and decisive. Garrett Page cooperated with investigators, which meant the cooperation was not entirely voluntary. The minivan and its occupants were located. Several accounts were frozen. Several people who had been very comfortable for a very long time became significantly less so. None of that is the point. The point is Audrey, her mother, whose name the original missing persons report had listed simply as Jess Page, estranged, turned out to live 45 minutes outside Kansas City. She was a nurse. She'd been trying to establish custody for 2 years. She didn't know what Garrett had done until Hollis knocked on her door at 8 a.m. and she heard her daughter's voice on the phone on the other end of the call. Declan was the one who handed Audrey the phone. He wasn't supposed to be in the room for that. It wasn't his moment. He didn't belong in it. But Audrey had looked up at him when they said her mother was on the phone, and something in the look, not fear, not the please don't go of a scared kid, just a very direct, very specific request from a person who'd decided he was trustworthy, made him stay. He stood by the window while Audrey talked to her mother. He looked at the parking lot. He thought about nothing in particular. When the call ended, Audrey set the phone down on the table very carefully, like it was something valuable. Then she looked up at him. "She's coming to get me," she said. "Good," he said. A pause. "Will I see you again?" He should have said no. The honest, practical answer was no. Their worlds had intersected for one night because of a set of circumstances that wouldn't repeat, and now they were over, and that was how it should work. He said, "I don't know." She seemed to accept that as honest. She nodded once and picked up her ladybug backpack. "You kept your promise," she told him. "You said somewhere safe, and it was." He looked at her. 8 years old, pigtails still crooked. One light-up sneaker had come untied at some point and nobody had noticed. "You kept yours too," he said. She looked confused. "I didn't make one." "You gave a stranger half your granola bar," he said, "in the middle of the night. That's a kind of promise." She thought about that very seriously. Then she smiled. The first time he'd seen her smile, and it was the kind that took over a whole face, completely unreserved. She left with her mother 3 hours later. Jess Page was a small woman with the same gray eyes, who'd been crying since she got out of the car and kept it completely together in front of her daughter anyway. She shook Declan's hand in the lobby, held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," he said. "You stayed with her." "Yes. Why?" It wasn't an accusation. Just someone trying to understand something that didn't fit their picture of how the world worked. Declan thought about it, which wasn't something he usually did with questions like that. He usually answered or deflected without considering, but this felt like it deserved the real answer. "She offered me half her food," he said, "before she knew my name." Jess Page looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, like that made sense, and walked out to where Audrey was waiting by the car, backpack on both shoulders, watching the sky go from gray to pale gold. Declan stood in the lobby of the federal building at 7 a.m., which was not a place he'd ever expected to be. Hollis came up beside him. "You know this doesn't change anything," Hollis said. "About you, your situation. I know. We still have." "I know," Declan said again. "That's not why I did it." Hollis was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you do it?" Declan watched Jess Page buckle her daughter into the back seat of a car that needed its front bumper repainted. Watched Audrey say something that made her mother laugh. Watched the car pull out of the lot and disappear around the corner. "She sat in the dark for 9 hours, he said. "And she didn't break. And when the first person who stopped was someone like me, she gave him half her granola bar." He paused. That kind of person deserves to have somebody stay. He walked back to his Escalade. Got in. Sat for a moment in the parking lot, the engine not yet on, the early morning sitting quiet around him. He had missed his meeting by 4 hours. He had walked into a federal building voluntarily, which was the kind of thing that created complications. He had made a promise to an 8-year-old girl he'd found at a highway rest stop, and he had kept it. And now she was in a car going home to her mother, and the weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Since before that rest stop, since before this night, since a long time before that, felt, for just a moment, slightly less. He started the engine. On the passenger seat, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small piece of paper, folded twice, placed there with the deliberate carefulness of someone who'd done it very intentionally. He picked it up. Inside, in the large, round handwriting of a child who was still learning to make her letters even, "Thank you for not driving away. Audrey Page P.S. I left you the rest of the granola bar in the cup holder." He looked at the cup holder. There was a granola bar there. Declan Farrow, who had not smiled in what felt like a decade, sat alone in the parking lot of a federal building at 7 in the morning and smiled. They say the most dangerous men are the ones with nothing to lose. But that's not quite right. The most dangerous men, the most unpredictable, the most impossible to control, are the ones who suddenly find something worth protecting, something that doesn't fit any calculation, something that asks for half a granola bar first and a promise second. Those men, once they've decided, don't stop. And Declan Farrow had decided. Drop a comment below and tell me, when was the last time someone surprised you like that? When did someone do the unexpected thing, the thing that didn't make sense on paper, and changed something? I want to know. And if this story stayed with you, hit that like button, because it helps more than you know, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The stories at Sadie's Romance Library don't end the way you think they will. That's kind of the whole point. The most broken people, it turns out, keep the most important promises. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, all it takes to reach them is half a granola bar and a pair of light-up sneakers.